Hello and welcome to The Entrepreneurs on Monocle Radio, the show all about inspiring people, innovative companies and fresh ideas in global business. On today's programme, we're meeting the founders of a wine company importing and distributing artisanal old world wines to the Mexican market.
There can't be innovation without tradition and vice versa, and I think Mexico is a beautiful exploration of that idea, and so we just bring in the tradition side a little bit.
It's just such a rich tapestry in terms of what is there to explore. It's been really fun to find those threads and to find those affinities because we have found so many of them between Italian wine and Mexican cuisine.
This is The Entrepreneurs with me, Tom Edwards. You're listening to The Entrepreneurs. Mexico City native Gonzalo Gout and New York transplant Larissa are the wine-loving duo behind Vinos Enteros, a wine importing and distribution company they uncorked in 2017, with the vision to bring wines rich in history to Mexico's capital. Vinos Enteros partners with winemakers who focus on artisanal production, highlighting the unique qualities of their grapes, vineyards and regions. These producers typically follow organic and biodynamic practices, harvesting the grapes by hand and handling them minimally, often bottling the wines unfiltered and unfined. And I'm delighted to say we're joined by Gonzalo and Larissa now. Guys, a warm welcome. Let's go back to the start of the journey. I often like to start with the origin story, although it is a bit of a cliche. But I love that even on your website you talk about this founding story. It invites us a scene of hospitality, a wintry night, 2016, and these two, destinies meeting almost. It sounds like the start of a rom-com, but that is how the business began, I understand it. Take us back to that wintry night. What came to pass?
Oh my gosh, I love how you just teed that up. And I always say that Gonzalo is my work husband and that, were things not different in a couple of different fashions, we might have been a real husband and wife team. But basically, it was very serendipitous. We were both invited to a dinner. We share a mutual friend. We just had this amazing chemistry. So we sat next to one another.
Well, I remember first when I walk in, I was a little bit late because as Mexicans, we tend to be. And I walked into this pizzeria and the mutual friend had terrible taste in wine. And so I look at the table and there's this wine from an obscure region in the north of Italy that's a great value. And I turn to Victor and say, Victor, wow, this is impressive. How did you choose this wine? And he said it was actually Larissa. And I knew I wanted to sit next to her and talk about wine a little bit.
And so that's exactly what we did. We had a great night. And then we kept in touch. And a few months later, we both realized that with our respective partners, we were moving to Mexico City. In my case, relocating. In Gonzalo's case, going home. And we both wanted to do something with wine. And more specifically, we wanted to bring the wines that we loved, soulful, artisanal European wines, to Mexico. Because at that point, they were not really abundant, I would say.
Yeah. And in true rom-com fashion, like you mentioned, we had our second date. We were both very nervous. We chose a wine bar in the Lower East Side. And, we were fighting a little bit over who got to choose first because neither of us wanted to take that first step. And it turns out that after a couple of wine bars and a couple of bottles, we learned that we had a very, very similar palate and we liked the same things. So it just became sort of a natural step to move forward. After that, Larissa invited me to meet a friend of hers in LA who is an Italian wine importer, and that was sort of the initial part of the portfolio. And we had a beautiful dinner there, and the relationship just kept growing. And I think we're very not only like palated, but also like-minded. No?
Well, yeah. And listen, I will obviously get into more detail about the kind of old world wine and new world wine and this idea of blending all of these different kind of values. But just on the point, because often on this program I ask people, you hear stories of people who realize they have a shared interest or they have a separate passion for something alongside their day job. What's the X factor though that means you have that conversation, you enjoy one another's company, but then you're like, right, let's do this thing as a going concern. That presumably taps into some other kind of quality, an entrepreneurial zeal maybe, fearlessness about taking a step into the unknown. What's the difference that makes some people go and do that thing rather than just idly talk about it, which is perhaps a little more the camp that I'm in?
I think that's a really fascinating question, and it's something that I've given some thought to. So for me, this was my first and my only entrepreneurial venture, and it's not something that I had always thought, I want to do this, but really I just felt like it was this incredibly serendipitous moment, kind of written in the cosmos, if you will, where, I met this great, smart man, so aligned with me in terms of palette, but also I think in terms of work style, in terms of kind of intellectual curiosity. And so there was just like a fit on so many different levels. And it really did feel, I think, rare and just right. Like I've never had any doubts about working with Gonzalo. I think that it's
Agreed.
a really, really great partnership. And that's not to say that we always agree, but I think that there is so much agreement, and then there is so much respect for the way that one another thinks. And then beyond that, I think we also really have fun and enjoy what we're doing, enjoy one another, enjoy traveling to Italy together.
Yeah, we feed into our hedonistic streak often. I think also, if I might add to it, I completely agree with Larissa, but I think another key was we both had full-time jobs that, were comfortable. And I think when we started, it wasn't like we were leaving everything behind and jumping into jumping off a cliff. So it felt very gradual. And up until last year, when Larissa started working in Vinos Enteros full time, it was this sort of side project that grew in a very organic manner with little pressure in that sense, little pressure to, make ends meet, because this is not where we both have derived our livelihood, right? So it became a little bit less intense as an entrepreneurial venture when we first started. And now, it's, 5 years later and, 7 years later. I still say 5, but 7 years later. And it's a completely different thing, right? But I think that when risk is incremental, it's much easier to swallow.
No, that's a really interesting point, actually. Let's talk then a little bit about the passion for old world wines, because again, through both of your kind of personal histories, obviously you've refined the craft of your noses, your palates at various levels, and Gonzalo, you've done lots of work on the operational and the restaurant management side as well, where you've had the opportunity to do that. But talk about that shared palate, this shared interest in these smaller artisanal creators of wine, the unique, complexities and fascinations of these particular old world vintages that you're interested in. I don't know, where did that come from? Larissa, if I come to you first of all, was that just the product of trying a bunch of stuff, realizing what you liked? Was it the story? Was it the stories, this richness of history? Tell me where the love affair with the particular wines that you're so obsessed with began.
Yeah, I think it's both of those things, right? So it was certainly exposure, trying a lot of wine, and then I think hand in hand with having a more practical sort of ability to define what I like, and the vocabulary and the information base. It was discovering that what I liked was wine that did have stories, that we always use this phrase that I think has come to really encapsulate for us why these wines that we work with are so special. And it's not because they're delicious, but also because they're cultural products. And so there are vehicles through which stories can be told. We can understand history, anthropology, migratory patterns. And so for me, gradual process. I think that, earlier in my 20s, the opportunity to date wine importers and chefs and and the like gave me a lot of exposure to wine. But then it was really about sticking with that passion, taking courses, traveling whenever I had the chance, spending almost all of my free income on wine in order to keep on trying and learning. But those were some of the things that came together for me to take me where I am today in terms of my palate and what has really seeded our portfolio.
Well, yeah, and just quickly on that, you've described yourself as a lifelong student. I presume you mean this is the kind of endless, insatiable curiosity, which is clear in your personal journey. Is that what that's about? Just never losing the curiosity and the hunger or thirst, perhaps better in this case, to learn more?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's something that is, for me, it's bigger than wine. I mean, it's kind of just how I'm put together. I'm a very intellectually curious person. You can't see the background right now in our video chat, but behind my desk, there are just volumes upon volumes of books, and a lot of them lead towards food anthropology and wine, but there's also history and there's contemporary fiction and biographies. And so I am a very intellectually curious person, and I have found that wine provides me with this really, really rich lens through which to kind of examine a lot of these different things that grab my interest. And, you know, in addition to reading, I've also found that there's so many opportunities to take really fascinating wine courses. And so right now I'm actually working on my diploma through the Wine, Spirit, and Education Trust. And that's a 2-year program. And I hope beyond that to maybe study for the Master of Wine program if I'm able to get into that.
You're racking up the obvious qualifications to go with your business experience, Larissa. Gonzalo, let me ask you this, because you're a classically trained chef as well as a sommelier. Was your route into wine partly to do with that? The classic route, the combination, that the way that food and wine complement one another, or are you an insatiably curious individual, generally speaking, as well?
I also am an insatiably curious individual, and I think that part of the beauty of this project, like Larissa said, is that exploration, both on an everyday basis, but whenever we travel to Italy. And you know, on my end, for me, design and architecture and that more aesthetic side of culture overlaps with the curiosity that together we share. And so traveling through wine regions, wine countries, is just such a fascinating thing to do. But for me, I think, you know, I grew up in a family, in both families, both my father and my mother's side, big families, and very much families that lived around a table. Both of my grandmothers had very large dining rooms that we sat at every week. And that's where my passion for food and beverage came from that, like Larissa said, you know, that vehicle for social interaction, for creating meaningful relationships, for, you know, enjoying, for the catharsis of letting go of a day and spending time and laughing and music and such. And so for me, that was sort of where I went through. I started cooking and I thought that was the obvious path, but very quickly in professional kitchens, I realized that I was missing exactly that. And I think for me, wine was the pathway where I could still, you know, explore my palate, explore stories behind ingredients, agriculture, producers, but do it in a way where I was having FaceTime with people. And so wine was my transition to front of the house, to the dining room. And, you know, once there, I think wine is this rabbit hole where you never stop learning, right? Because like Larissa pointed out, it's stories that are attached to those bottles of wine. And the bottles of wine are just these artifacts for the knowledge and the stories behind them. And so you become a little bit of a storyteller, a little bit of a narrator when you're a sommelier, and, you know, obviously importing and selling wines to restaurants. And that's just beautiful because it's sharing a meaningful human experience or human connection that I think that, you know, sommeliers, restaurants, and ultimately guests in the restaurant will be able to connect to.
Yeah, it's sort of poetic. It's almost philosophical, Gonzalo. I have to pause and think about that for a second. Let's talk a little bit about Vinos Enteros then, because we've alluded to what the business actually does. In a way, I kind of just want to get you guys to unpack that a bit. I don't want to misspeak, but you import wine. There's a distribution component. I know you also provide that as a service. Is this right? To certain, obviously, restaurants, as you've mentioned there, Gonzalo, but to private individuals. Can you guys just tell us a little bit about how the business actually kind of works on a day-to-day? What are the nuts and bolts operationally of how all of this beautiful sort of backstory has delivered the business that you guys run today?
Well, Mexican bureaucracy is famously intense, and I think that's something that we have in common with Italians. And so we feel very much at home bureaucratically in both places. Going back to your second question, how do you launch yourself into this? I think there was also an element of naivety to launching ourselves into this and, registering as importers and as alcohol distributors. And had we known then what we know now of the complexity of navigating the system, I think we probably would have started in a different route, maybe outsourcing a lot of things. But, we set up a good system since the beginning. We gave a friend of ours a little percentage of the company. He's a fantastic lawyer, and so he's been instrumental in helping us. His name is Sergio. And I think now I tend to say that it's like a video game, and there's this other side of me that, beyond the curiosity of the hedonistic curiosity of figuring out other cultures and learning about faraway places and lands, there's also a very intense satisfaction of beating the system and making sure that, things tick and through processes and organization that we're able to bring it. So the back end is very technical and very bureaucratic, but I think it's a nice counterpoint to the romantic side. And I think naturally, we never decided it since the beginning, but naturally, Larissa and I have drifted towards specific parts of the business that need attention. And I tend to work more on the bureaucratic technical side, and Larissa is fantastic at the marketing website, the more of the forward facing or the face presenting side of the business.
God bless Gonzalo and his Excel macros. But to come back to the other part of your question, so the heart of our business, and it really always has been, is focused on our distribution to wholesale clients, and namely selling to fine dining restaurants. And those restaurants are all across the country. So we do some importation as a service. We do work with private clients. But again, the heart and soul of our business is really collaborating with our restaurant clients.
Guys, I did want to ask you one question, which is just about this meeting of old world wines with, I guess, a newer world location in wine terms. Because some people might say, well, look, wouldn't it be intuitive? In Mexico City, you've got greater adjacencies to New World wines, and it's such a good story to tell. But that's only, I don't know, it's a little, only a sort of snapshot of the picture. Can you articulate why it is that sitting in this incredible, intoxicating F&B market that you're in, why is that the perfect place into which we should parachute, perhaps even literally, some of these amazing old world wines? What's the chemistry that happens when you begin to mix these two things together?
Mexico is in a very interesting position geographically. Because we're next to the United States, which is probably arguably the most forward-looking country in the world. But we also have a very deep-rooted connection to Europe. I think specifically Spain and the wine culture there throughout history, but especially in the 20th century, there was a big Spanish migration during the Civil War. And I think that, wine is an interesting product because I think it's, like you very accurately pointed out, it's at the forefront, of this developing food and beverage scene, but it also represents a lot of rootedness and tradition. And I think both Larissa and I are a little bit of old souls, first of all, and I think that the old world wines tend to be a little bit more rooted in their stories. They tend to be several generations or, centuries longer or deeper, whereas the New World wines tend to be, 1, 2, perhaps 3 generations, but a little bit of a newer product. And I think for both of us, that just pulls a curiosity a little bit deeper, into history, into context, like Larissa mentioned, migrations, borders. We were just in Friuli on the border with Slovenia. It was just fascinating to explore. But I do think that the dichotomy or the contrast of having, these beautifully classic artisanal products from Europe with such a vibrant food culture here has been a really interesting mix, because the food culture here is also a little bit of that. There's a lot of innovation, but it's also there's a lot of tradition. And I think like Enrique Olvera, who I work with, one of my favorite phrases of his is, there can't be innovation without tradition and vice versa. And I think Mexico is a beautiful exploration of that idea. And so we just, bring in the tradition side a little bit. I mean, not to say that a lot of our winemakers don't innovate with their winemaking techniques and such, but I think that there is that more romantic side of what we do. Would you agree?
I would. And I think that the only thing I would add to what Gonzalo said is that Italy in particular has really just kind of gotten its tentacles around us, and we're never going to escape from it, because it accounts for almost half of all of the grape varieties that exist in the world today. So it's just such a rich tapestry in terms of what is there to explore. Every region has just a plethora of grapes, a plethora of traditions. And so I think we've just found so much to pull from, to learn about, to match and to play with as we think about all of the regional differences with the cuisine here. And it's been really fun to find those threads and to find those affinities, because we have found so many of them between Italian wine and Mexican cuisine.
Guys, you probably are going to despise me asking this question, but I like to do a little bit of sort of quick fire round where I ask some more kind of banal questions, which you'll feel free to ignore them, but I'm going to ask them anyway. One of them is, paint me a picture of a jolly scene. I'll give you an example. Let's say I don't know, went to meet some friends on a holiday, and I was in Tuscany under one of those, relaxing trees, the sunlight dappling down. Somebody served me, a playful Vermentino, and it was a perfect moment. Paint me one of those pictures. Can you pick one just to give us a little flavour of, I don't know, you talked about, some recent journeys you've been on. Is there maybe one moment you can pick out that jumps out just to set the scene for us?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of the trip that Gonzalo and I most recently took together, which was the first one in 5 years, in April of 2024 to Italy, due to pandemic and children and things of that nature. And it was our first visit to a winemaker in 5 years together. We were in Friuli on a sun-dappled afternoon in a very bucolic setting, rolling hills near the Slovenian border, and a glass of crisp, fresh, minerally rosé di Cialla made from 100% Refosco was poured in our glasses by the matriarch of Ronchi di Cialla. And it was just one of those magical moments with a light breeze kind of wafting through everyone's hair as we enjoyed an afternoon in the sunshine.
Okay,
love that.
Sold.
I was actually thinking part two of that evening when we walked into the dining room and she told us that she had, whipped together something casual. And that was, house-made pasta with buckwheat and these wild, we couldn't figure out, it was wild ramps. Nettles or ramps that she picked from the river down below in the property. And then braised a venison that her neighbor had hunted. And it was just, for me, a casual dinner is pasta with butter. But for her, that was a casual moment. And they opened some historic bottles. And I think it gained a little bit of a much more special moment, because that was also one of the first visits that we did together several years ago. And it was just very nice to be back in Italy with Larissa. I had missed her there a lot.
A big thank you and cheers, santé, good health to Gonzalo Gout and Larissa Lawrence, co-founders of Vinos Enteros. And to find out more and to check out their carefully curated selection of wines, head on over to vinosenteros.mx. And that's all for this episode of the programme. We'll be back at the same time next week. Do look out for another Eureka moment every Friday. The Entrepreneurs was produced by Laura Kramer with audio editing by Jack Dewars. Listen again and find out more about the show and all our others at monocle.com. You can always follow us and catch up with the archive wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with the Entrepreneurs team, email Laura on lrk@monocle.com. I'm Tom Edwards. Goodbye, and thanks for listening to The Entrepreneurs.